The Nexus War Academy floated in the void between three dying stars, a monument to galactic military might that somehow managed to look both impressive and pretentious at the same time. Its crystalline spires twisted toward the cosmos like the desperate fingers of a drowning bureaucrat, while its massive training halls hummed with the kind of aggressive energy that only came from cramming thousands of young, hormonal aliens into a space designed by committee. For over 3 millennia, the Academy had been churning out the galaxy's finest warriors, or at least the ones with the best connections and the loudest parents. Every species worth mentioning sent their brightest and most violent offspring here to learn the ancient arts of combat, strategy, and how to file proper casualty reports. The Zephyrians came with their forearms and superiority complexes. The Drakmori arrived breathing sulfur and existential dread. Even the Crystalline Collective managed to send representatives, though nobody was quite sure how rocks could be violent until they met one in a dark alley. The Academy's philosophy was beautifully simple: might makes right, and if you can't make might, you probably shouldn't have bothered showing up. This worked wonderfully for everyone involved, creating a delightfully toxic environment where species could compete to see who could be the most efficiently brutal, while maintaining the thin veneer of civilized education. Then the humans showed up. The Terran Exchange Program, as it was so diplomatically named, had been someone's idea of a cosmic joke. Some paper-pushing administrator in the Galactic Council had looked at the application from this backwater species and thought, why not? What's the worst that could happen? It was the kind of decision that historians would later describe as regrettable and possibly influenced by recreational pharmaceuticals. High Marshal Zex Thara, the Academy's commandant, had initially treated the whole thing as an amusing diversion. Humans were the galactic equivalent of house pets that had learned to use tools, cute, but hardly threatening. Their application boasted about their adaptability and strategic thinking, which was rather like a slug bragging about its aerodynamic properties. The first human exchange student had arrived 3 months ago, and the Academy had been having a grand time ever since. Voss was her name, though most of the alien cadets had taken to calling her the Quiet One or that weird mammal. She was unremarkable in the way that beige paint was unremarkable, present, technically functional, but hardly worth noticing. Kira stood barely 5.5 feet tall, which made her an adorable midget by Academy standards. Her brown hair was kept in a practical bun that screamed military regulation, and her dark eyes had the unsettling habit of watching everything without seeming to judge. She moved with a kind of careful economy that suggested either excellent training or severe social anxiety. The betting pools were split 50-50 on which. What made Kira truly fascinating to observe was a complete failure to fit into the Academy's carefully maintained ecosystem of aggression and posturing. While Drakmori cadets spent their mornings roaring challenges at their breakfast, and Zephyrian students practiced intimidation displays in the corridors, Kira simply existed in her own quiet bubble of human peculiarity. She attended classes on advanced tactical slaughter, with the same expression most people reserved for grocery shopping. During combat philosophy seminars, where other species would debate the finer points of honorable dismemberment, Kira would sit in the back taking notes like she was auditing a particularly boring lecture on tax law. Even during physical conditioning, where cadets traditionally tried to establish dominance through creative violence, she would complete her exercises with mechanical precision and then wait patiently for everyone else to finish their territorial displays. The other cadets found this behavior deeply unsettling. Vex Grimscale, a particularly obnoxious Drakmori with anger management issues and a collection of intimidating scars, had taken it upon himself to educate the human about proper Academy behavior. His teaching methods primarily involved increasingly elaborate attempts at humiliation, which Kira endured with the patience of someone waiting for a particularly slow elevator. "Look at the little mammal," Vex would announce during mess hall gatherings, his sulphurous breath fogging the air around his scaled head. "So quiet. So meek. I wonder if she even knows what violence is, or if her species just hugs their problems to death." The laughter that followed these observations had the forced quality of people who weren't entirely sure what they were laughing at, but didn't want to be left out. Kira would continue eating her protein rations with the same methodical approach she applied to everything else, occasionally glancing up with an expression that might have been mild interest or complete indifference. This dynamic had persisted for weeks, creating a comfortable routine of mockery that everyone could rely on. The Academy's social order remained intact, with humans firmly established at the bottom of the food chain, just above the automated cleaning units and slightly below the potted plants in the hydroponics lab. Everything changed on a Tuesday, because of course it did. Tuesdays had a reputation throughout the galaxy for being cosmically significant in the most inconvenient ways possible. The morning had started normally enough, with the usual collection of intimidation displays and creative threats being exchanged over breakfast. Thrakk Bloodclaw, the Academy's undisputed champion and the kind of being whose name alone required hazard pay for pronouncing, had been holding court at the center of the mess hall. Standing nearly 8 feet tall and built like a particularly aggressive building, Thrakk represented everything the Academy stood for: overwhelming force, casual brutality, and the sort of confidence that came from never having been meaningfully challenged. Thrakk belonged to the Vorthak species, beings who had evolved from something that looked like the unholy offspring of a bear, a tank, and a particularly bad mood. His hide was covered in the kind of natural armor that made personal weapons seem optimistic, and his forearms ended in claws that could carve their way through most known materials. He had been Academy champion for 2 years running, a streak that had ended several promising careers and at least one cadet's ability to digest solid food. The champion was regaling his audience with stories of his latest victory, embellishing details that were already impressive enough to require their own insurance policies. His opponent had been a crystalline collective warrior, and according to Thrakk's version of events, the fight had lasted long enough for him to demonstrate 17 different dismantling techniques before achieving victory through what could generously be called superior firepower. The crystal being actually thought it could match Vorthak's strength, Thrakk rumbled, his voice carrying the kind of casual menace that made furniture nervous. I showed it the era of its mineral thinking. Now it serves as decorative gravel in my personal quarters. The audience made appropriately appreciative noises, because disagreeing with Thrakk about anything was generally considered a form of assisted suicide. Even the Academy's instructors gave the champion a wide berth, partly out of respect for his abilities and partly because his idea of friendly conversation tended to involve property damage. It was at this moment of perfect Academy harmony that Voss chose to walk past Thrakk's table, carrying her breakfast tray with the same unhurried precision she applied to everything else. She wasn't trying to be noticed, wasn't attempting to make a statement, wasn't doing anything more provocative than existing in the same general area as the champion. In a more reasonable universe, this would have been the end of it. Unfortunately, the universe had stopped being reasonable sometime around the invention of faster-than-light travel. Thrakk's eyes, all 4 of them, tracked the human's movement with the kind of predatory focus usually reserved for wounded prey. Something about her complete lack of reaction to his presence struck him as personally offensive, as if her indifference was somehow diminishing his carefully cultivated aura of menace. "Little mammal," Thrakk called out, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet mess hall with the subtlety of a gravitational collapse. "I notice you show no proper respect to your betters. Perhaps you need education in Academy hierarchy." Kira stopped walking, not because she was afraid, but with the resigned patience of someone whose train had just been delayed indefinitely. She turned to face the champion with the same expression she might use to acknowledge a slightly persistent door-to-door salesman. "I apologize if I've caused offense," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite its modest volume. "That wasn't my intention." The response was so perfectly, diplomatically neutral, that it somehow managed to be more insulting than any direct challenge could have been. Thrakk's quad brain processed this for several seconds, trying to find the hidden aggression that surely must be lurking behind such careful politeness. When he failed to detect any, his confusion transformed into the kind of anger that usually preceded significant architectural damage. Intention. Thrakk rose from his seat, unfolding to his full imposing height like a natural disaster with anger management issues. "I care nothing for your mammalian intentions. I care only that you learn proper deference to superior species." The mess hall had gone completely silent now, with the kind of anticipatory quiet that preceded either spectacular entertainment or mass casualties. Other cadets began subtly repositioning themselves to ensure optimal viewing angles while maintaining safe distances from the potential blast radius. Kira set her breakfast tray down on the nearest table with careful precision, as if she were handling delicate crystal rather than standard-issue Academy dinnerware. When she straightened up, something had changed in her posture, a subtle shift that most observers missed, but that sent warning signals through the more experienced fighters present. "I understand you're trying to establish dominance," Kira said, her tone remaining conversational despite the growing tension. "It's a perfectly natural behavior for your species. But I'd prefer to finish my breakfast in peace, if that's acceptable." If Thrakk had possessed any meaningful experience with tactical thinking, he might have recognized the warning signs. The human's complete lack of visible fear, her casual acknowledgement of his species' behavioral patterns, the way she'd automatically positioned herself in the most tactically advantageous spot in the immediate area, all of these should have suggested that perhaps this particular mammal might not be quite as helpless as she appeared. Instead, Thrakk heard only disrespect wrapped in polite words, and his response was as predictable as gravity. "Acceptable," he roared, spittle flying from his mandibles like precipitation from a very angry storm cloud. "I am Thrakk Bloodclaw, champion of Nexus War Academy. Nothing happens here without my acceptance." He took a step forward, then another, his massive form casting a shadow that seemed to absorb light from the surrounding area. His claws extended with metallic clicks that sounded like death-taking roll call. The display was impressive, terrifying, and completely wasted on someone who had spent the last 3 months studying exactly this kind of intimidation technique. "I challenge you, little mammal," Thrakk declared with a kind of dramatic flair that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so completely predictable. "Combat circle, tomorrow at midday. The Academy will witness how Voss deal with disrespectful prey." The silence that followed was broken only by the gentle hum of life support systems, and what might have been someone placing a bet in the back of the room. All eyes turned to Kira, waiting to see how the quiet human would react to being challenged by the most dangerous being in the Academy. Kira nodded once, as if she'd just been asked to pick up some groceries on her way home. "That's acceptable," she said. The next 24 hours passed with the kind of frantic energy that usually preceded galactic disasters or really spectacular sporting events. News of the challenge spread through the Academy faster than rumors about menu changes, and by evening, the entire institution was buzzing with anticipation and increasingly creative betting pools. The odds were not kind to humanity. Professional bookmakers who had traveled from 3 systems away were offering ratios that suggested Kira's chances of survival fell somewhere between optimistic and mathematically theoretical. The smart money was on how long she would last, with most bets clustering around the 15-second mark. High Marshal Zexthara found herself in the uncomfortable position of trying to decide whether to intervene. On one hand, watching a member of a diplomatic exchange program get reduced to component atoms on her watch would probably generate the kind of paperwork that could end careers. On the other hand, interfering with a formal challenge would violate Academy tradition and might result in something even worse, administrative review. She settled for a compromise that satisfied no one and protected nothing, issuing a formal statement that the Academy respected the right of all cadets to engage in educational violence while strongly encouraging reasonable tactical restraint. It was the kind of bureaucratic non-position that would look good in reports while providing exactly zero practical protection for anyone involved. Meanwhile, Kira spent a final day of quasi-mortality in much the same way she'd spent all her previous days, attending classes, completing assignments, and giving no outward sign that she was about to face almost certain death at the hands of a professionally violent killing machine. Her behavior was so perfectly normal that some observers began to wonder if she truly understood what she'd agreed to. Colonel Rivers, the human liaison officer and the closest thing Kira had to supervision, attempted several conversations that danced around the subject of tactical withdrawal. These discussions went nowhere, partly because Kira seemed genuinely uninterested in backing down, and partly because she kept responding to expressions of concern with a kind of bland reassurance usually reserved for minor scheduling conflicts. "I appreciate your concern, Colonel," she would say, "but I'm confident everything will work out appropriately." It was the sort of response that made Rivers wonder if the human military had started recruiting from philosophy departments or psychiatric facilities. Either way, he found himself making contingency plans for what would probably be the galaxy's first diplomatic incident involving voluntary splatter patterns. The day of the challenge dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that suggested the universe was ensuring optimal visibility for whatever was about to happen. The Academy's main combat arena, a circular space designed to contain violence while providing excellent sight lines for spectators, filled early with beings from across the known galaxy. They came not just from the Academy, but from nearby systems, having traveled specifically to witness what was being billed as either the shortest fight in Academy history or the most spectacular example of interspecies violence since the Crystalline Collective had discovered percussion instruments. Vendors had set up stalls selling refreshments, commemorative weapons, and insurance policies with surprisingly reasonable premiums. The arena itself was a masterpiece of practical design and barely contained bloodlust. Its floor was composed of some material that could absorb significant impact while providing excellent traction for various ambulatory appendages. The walls were transparent aluminum, strong enough to contain most forms of explosive violence while allowing spectators an unobstructed view of whatever educational brutality was about to unfold. Thrakk entered first, because champions always entered first and because no one was suicidal enough to suggest otherwise. He moved with the confident swagger of a being who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be resolved through applied violence. His natural armor gleamed under the arena's lights like polished death, and his forearms flexed in sequence with the rhythmic precision of a martial kata designed by homicidal engineers. The crowd's response was immediate and appreciative. Cheers, roars, and various species-specific expressions of approval filled the air with enough aggressive energy to power a small starship. Thrakk acknowledged the adulation with the gracious humility of a natural disaster accepting applause for its destructive efficiency. Then Kira entered, and the crowd's enthusiasm took on a different quality entirely. She walked into the arena with the same unhurried pace she used for everything else, wearing standard Academy combat gear that looked like it had been designed by committees with no imagination and even less fashion sense. Her hair was still in its regulation bun, her expression was still carefully neutral, and her entire demeanor suggested someone who was mildly inconvenienced rather than facing imminent dismemberment. The contrast was so stark it was almost artistic. Thrakk represented everything the Academy celebrated: size, strength, obvious lethality, and the kind of presence that made insurance adjusters nervous. Kira represented everything the Academy tolerated: small, quiet, unimpressive, and possessed of all the obvious combat capability of a particularly well-behaved houseplant. High Marshal Zexthar arose from her observation platform, her amplified voice carrying across the arena with the authority of someone who had learned to project confidence even when privately questioning her life choices. "Cadets of Nexus War Academy," she began, because formal occasions demanded formal speeches even when everyone just wanted to see someone get professionally disassembled. Today we witness a challenge between champion Thrakk Bloodclaw of Vorthak and exchange student Kira Voss of Terra. Combat will continue until one participant yields, becomes unable to continue, or is reduced to constituent elements. The crowd appreciated this last clarification, which had been added after an unfortunate incident involving a Crystalline Collective student and some very persistent mineral fragments. "Combatants," Zexthara continued, "you may begin when ready." What happened next took approximately 4 seconds, though later analysis would stretch those seconds into hours of frame-by-frame examination and increasingly wild theoretical speculation. Thrakk opened with his signature move, a forearm charge that had ended more careers than budget cuts and policy changes combined. It was a beautiful display of coordinated lethality, with each arm following a precisely calculated trajectory designed to make evasion impossible and resistance futile. His claws carved through the air with a kind of physics-defying grace that suggested either extensive training or supernatural assistance. For exactly 2 seconds, it looked like the fight would proceed according to everyone's expectations. Then Kira moved. She didn't dodge Thrakk's charge so much as seemed to briefly exist in a space that the charge wasn't occupying. Her response was so economical it appeared almost casual, a subtle shift in position that placed her inside Thrakk's reach at exactly the moment when his attack became committed and irreversible. What followed was a demonstration of applied physics that would have impressed combat engineers and terrified mathematicians. Kira's first strike targeted a nerve cluster that most beings didn't even know they possessed, delivered with a kind of precision that suggested either extensive anatomical knowledge or really good guessing. Thrakk's roar of triumph transformed into something that sounded like surprise being fed through a wood chipper. Her second strike hit a structural weak point in Vorthak physiology that was typically only accessible during voluntary medical examinations or very specific industrial accidents. The sound it made was later described by witnesses as concerning and probably illegal in most civilized systems. The third and final strike was delivered with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone turning off a particularly stubborn piece of machinery. It targeted the intersection of Thrakk's primary nervous system and his redundant motor controls, causing a cascade failure that shut down his ability to remain vertical, conscious, or dignified. Thrakk collapsed with the graceless finality of a building that had just received notice of condemnation. His impact with the arena floor registered on seismic sensors 3 levels down and caused several spectators to spill their refreshments. He lay there in a sprawl of unconscious limbs and injured pride, breathing steadily but showing no signs of returning to awareness anytime soon. The silence that followed was a kind of absolute quiet usually associated with vacuum or really effective noise-canceling technology. 4,000 beings from across the galaxy sat in perfect, stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed and failing to make it fit with any known model of reality. Kira straightened up, checked Thrakk's pulse with the same clinical detachment she might use to verify that a door was properly locked, then turned to face the observation platform, where High Marshal Zexthara sat frozen in an expression of bureaucratic horror. "Marshal," Kira said, her voice carrying clearly in the absolute silence, "I believe the match is concluded. Should I report to medical for post-combat evaluation?" The question snapped Zexthara out of her paralysis, though her response had the slightly mechanical quality of someone whose brain was still buffering. "Medical evaluation. Yes, that would be appropriate," she managed. "Also, perhaps you could report to my office afterward for debriefing." Kira nodded with the same polite acknowledgement she'd shown throughout her entire academy experience, then walked toward the arena exit with her characteristic unhurried pace. Behind her, medical teams were swarming around Thrakk's unconscious form, their scanners confirming what everyone already knew. The champion was definitively, comprehensively, and professionally unconscious. As she passed through the arena's exit, the silence finally broke. It started as a whisper, then grew into excited conversation, then exploded into the kind of chaotic discussion that usually followed natural disasters or really significant sporting upsets. The subsequent investigation, conducted by beings who possessed advanced degrees in tactical analysis and still couldn't quite believe their own sensor readings, revealed several interesting facts about exchange student Kira Voss. First, her academy application had listed her previous occupation as military consultant, which everyone had assumed was a polite way of saying unemployed. Further inquiry revealed that military consultant was actually a polite way of saying person who taught other people creative ways to end conflicts quickly. Second, her species designation as human had apparently been considered sufficient identification, without anyone bothering to check what specific subset of humanity she represented. This was rather like identifying someone simply as carbon-based without mentioning whether they were a flower or a fusion reactor. Third, and most significantly, Terra's military had apparently developed the habit of sending their most interesting graduates on cultural exchange programs with species that might benefit from exposure to alternative approaches to conflict resolution. It was diplomacy through demonstration, and Kira had just provided the galaxy's most prestigious military academy with a masterclass in practical applied violence. High Marshal Zexthara, reviewing these findings in the privacy of her office while nursing what she suspected was the beginning of a truly spectacular headache, found herself confronting the uncomfortable realization that the Terran exchange program had never been about education at all. It had been about advertising. The human sitting across from her desk, the same quiet, unassuming being who had just dismantled the Academy's champion with the casual efficiency of someone debugging a computer program, continued to maintain her perfectly polite, slightly confused expression. "Marshal," Kira said, "I hope I haven't caused any administrative difficulties." The combat protocols seemed straightforward, and Champion Bloodclaw did issue a formal challenge according to Academy regulations. Zexthara stared at her for a long moment, trying to reconcile the devastating efficiency she'd witnessed with the mild-mannered being who was now expressing concern about paperwork compliance. "Student Voss," she said finally, "perhaps you could clarify something for me. Your application listed extensive training in conflict resolution. Could you elaborate on what specific methodologies that training encompassed?" Kira's expression shifted slightly, taking on the patient look of someone who had been asked to explain something that should have been obvious. "Standard human military curriculum, Marshal. We focus primarily on identifying the most efficient path to conflict termination, while minimizing resource expenditure and collateral complications. The Academy's combat protocols are actually quite similar to our basic training exercises, though with more formal structure and better documentation requirements. The words were delivered with such casual matter-of-factness that it took Zexthara several seconds to process their implications. When she did, she felt something that might have been respect, terror, or possibly both. "I see," she said, though she suspected she was only seeing a very small fraction of whatever was actually going on. "And this represents typical human military capability." "Oh no, Marshal," Kira replied with what might have been modest embarrassment. "I'm just a training instructor. Our actual combat specialists are much more impressive." The silence that followed this revelation was broken only by the sound of Zexthara's stylus breaking under the pressure of a suddenly clenched fist. In the days that followed, the Academy underwent what could politely be described as a cultural adjustment period. The casual dismissal of human capabilities that had characterized the previous months evaporated like water in vacuum, replaced by a respectful wariness that occasionally bordered on paranoia. Cadets who had previously ignored Kira's presence now watched her movements with the focused attention usually reserved for unstable explosives or tax auditors. Instructors began including human tactical examples in their curricula, though they had to rely on theoretical frameworks since no one wanted to volunteer for practical demonstrations. Thrakk Bloodclaw recovered from his encounter with human conflict resolution after 3 days of intensive medical attention and even more intensive psychological counseling. When he finally returned to duty, he did so with a significantly reduced vocabulary of intimidating threats and a newfound appreciation for the subtle complexities of interspecies relations. He also developed the habit of being scrupulously polite to anyone shorter than 7 feet, just in case. The Academy's betting pools underwent a similar adjustment, with odds on human capabilities shifting from laughably optimistic to "please consult your insurance provider before placing wagers." Several professional bookmakers took early retirement, claiming that the new variables had made accurate predictions impossible without access to classified military intelligence. Colonel Rivers, meanwhile, found his role as human liaison transformed from damage control specialist to very important person whom everyone wanted to keep happy. His requests for resources, previously processed with the enthusiasm typically reserved for tax forms, were now handled with the kind of prompt attention usually given to emergency evacuation orders. Kira herself seemed largely unaware of these changes, continuing to attend classes, complete assignments, and exist in her own quiet bubble of professional competence. When asked about her newfound status as the Academy's most feared student, she expressed mild confusion and concern that she might have somehow violated proper protocol. The Galactic Council, receiving reports of these developments through channels that definitely did not include official diplomatic communications, began to reconsider their assumptions about human military capabilities. Several species that had previously viewed terror as an amusing curiosity started making quiet inquiries about the possibility of cultural exchange programs of their own. The applications were politely declined, with explanations that the human military was currently reviewing its educational outreach priorities and would be in touch when circumstances permitted expanded programming. This was diplomatic language, for we're too busy laughing to process new requests right now. 6 months later, as graduation ceremonies approached and exchange programs prepared to conclude, High Marshal Zexthara found herself composing what was possibly the most carefully worded report of her career. The document, which would eventually become required reading at military academies across 17 systems, concluded with an observation that would prove prophetic. The Terran Exchange Program has provided valuable insights into alternative approaches to military education and conflict resolution. While exchange student Voss has demonstrated remarkable adaptability to Academy protocols, her presence has also highlighted certain assumptions in our traditional evaluation methodologies that may warrant reconsideration. Future exchange programs should perhaps include more comprehensive preliminary assessments of participant capabilities and cultural contexts. It was bureaucratic language for holy stars. We had no idea what we were dealing with. The real lesson, though unwritten in any official report, was simpler and more profound. In a galaxy full of beings who had spent millennia perfecting the arts of intimidation and violence, sometimes the most dangerous opponent was the one who simply showed up, paid attention, and got the job done without making a fuss about it. The humans, it turned out, had been paying attention for quite some time. And that, perhaps more than any demonstration of individual capability, was what made their quiet student so genuinely terrifying to contemplate. She wasn't an anomaly or an exception. She was a preview of what happened when a species spent its developmental period learning that the universe was vast, hostile, and utterly indifferent to fair play. They had learned to be ready for anything, and they had gotten very, very good at it. The academy would never be quite the same, which was probably for the best.